Right before PulseCon started, I was chatting with a TOV guy in a little chat room we have in Discord, and I made the comment that the one way Avalon Hill could screw this thing up was to take everything we've seen so far, put it in one giant box, and slap a $300 price tag on it. And I followed it up with a video from The Simpsons of the release of the Homer. A quick disclaimer before I get started here. Even though I was part of the TOV live crew throughout the launch of the HasLab campaign, all the announcements, all that stuff, I don't have any inside information about Avalon Hill, about Age of Annihilation, about the development process, or anything like that. All my commentary here comes from some interviews with Chris and Patrick, as well as my interpretation of what they said, and then combine that with my experience of running tabletop game companies, selling tabletop miniature games at conventions, and running a few failed crowdfunding campaigns myself. Okay, with that out of the way, let's start with the very few things that we actually know about Age of Annihilation, how things are supposed to play out. In interviews, Chris Nato, who is the lead designer of Avalon Hill, did mention they had some sort of market research plan prior to the launch of all this Age of Annihilation stuff. However, he was fairly reluctant to provide any details as to what actually their plan was. So as long as they weren't doing some sort of Elon Musk YOLO style business thing, which I really don't think they were because they did spend a lot of money developing Age of Annihilation up to this point, clearly something went a bit sideways. Now, another common phrase Chris would use is the term cutting steel. This is in reference to the process of tooling or creating the molds for injection molded plastic miniatures. And this is an important clue. While mass production of injection molds for plastic miniatures is usually some sort of metal mold, they don't have to be steel. Aluminum is often used by companies as well. Aluminum molds are cheaper to manufacture than steel molds, but steel molds have a much longer lifespan. If Avalon Hill's plan was to only make 8,000 or so units for this crowdfunding campaign, then aluminum molds would probably have a good enough lifespan just for that. But the fact that they were willing to pay the money up front to get these steel molds was definitely suggesting they had a much longer production run of Heroscape planned. One more thing Chris mentioned, I'm pretty sure he even said this during the TOV live interview, was that he didn't want the starter set to be too small. He wanted to basically offer a very good gaming experience. Now, this is a common problem game companies have. In the past, I'm thinking in particular of Confrontation 4th Edition, Age of Ragnarok. It had a really small starter set, and it didn't provide a very good experience to playing the game, and because of that, that can result in players not wanting to spend more money if the starter set itself is not particularly fun to play. That being said, Age of Annihilation with its Vanguard edition had an absolutely massive starter set, but more on that a little bit later. So those were, I think, the three big pieces of factual information we have about Avalon Hill's approach to Age of Annihilation. Now I want to take some time and address some of the community comments that were reoccurring about the HasLab campaign or how the design of the game went. Now, unpainted miniatures were a common complaint on the internet. The challenge is determining just how many people actually chose not to back the set because of unpainted miniatures, or whether people were just saying that. When you've got only a single product to choose from, it's very difficult to determine exactly why someone did not buy the set. They could be saying unpainted miniatures, but the reality is there could be some other reason they didn't buy it, or maybe they never wanted to buy it in the first place, and they're just using this as using this excuse of unpainted miniatures as a way of justifying that they didn't want to buy it. It's a weird psychological thing going on here. Now, it's a common meme with games to say, well, we're not as expensive as Warhammer. And the reality is that's kind of a silly position to take, because a serious miniature wargamer who really enjoys a particular game is going to spend a bunch of money on it over a certain amount of time, regardless of that game being Warhammer or something else. All this quote really means is the person probably doesn't like Warhammer for some reason, and they're justifying not playing it, which, fair enough. As for Age of Annihilation, why that's kind of relevant here is the starter set with a $250 price tag on it. Frankly, it was a good value for what you got. The problem is, I think most players would likely end up spending $250 on Age of Annihilation, except doing so over the course of a year and not paying it all up front. This price tag, as I joked about in the intro, was probably one of the biggest contributing factors to why people did not contribute to the campaign, but once again, it's kind of hard to judge that. A multi-tier campaign could have looked a lot like what Hasbro did with HeroQuest, or Avalon Hill did with HeroQuest. I use the names interchangeably. Where there's 2 pledge levels. You had the base core game for like $130, and then you had a higher tier level which had the first 2 expansions and maybe a few other things in it. My only thought as to why Avalon Hill wouldn't go this route with Age of Annihilation is due to basically an accounting math thing. If you had, say, a $130 introduction Heroscape set, then you had the $250 Vanguard set, and 90% of the customers went for the cheaper option and only 10% went for the expensive option, what would happen is the cheaper option would make a ton of profit, and then the more expensive one would essentially look like it lost a ton of money, even if the entire campaign was profitable altogether. Now, another thing to keep in mind why they went that way with HeroQuest, not Heroscape. For HeroQuest, the 2 expansions that were available or going to be in the higher tier level reused the same miniatures that were in the base game, and therefore there wasn't a whole lot of increased production cost, because other than the miniatures, those expansions only had cardstock items, and cardstock items are relatively cheap to set up and produce compared to plastic injection molded miniatures. So what about a multi-choice campaign where you had maybe a $130 base game for Heroscape, and then you maybe had 2 or 3 other factions you could choose to optionally buy? Well, one, you run into the same problem I described a minute ago, where maybe one faction is sold a ton, the other 2 did not. Or also, I kind of got the sense, this is me and kind of reading between the lines, that perhaps the Hasbro Pulse system doesn't actually support that type of checkout. I kind of got the feeling that Chris was a bit frustrated with the Hasbro Pulse system, but that's, once again, that's kind of me just reading between the lines and kind of interpreting things he said. He never actually believed he exactly said that statement. Of all the community comments, this was the one that probably was the most important, the most dead on, and had the biggest impact on the campaign itself. Initially with the HasLab page, if you didn't know what Heroscape was, you really couldn't figure out a whole lot what it was based on the content of the page. There was no rule book. There was no video kind of showing a playthrough of the game. There was no just overview of what the game really was. And frankly, it was kind of hard to even tell that it was a game. You could figure it out by looking at the things, but it wasn't super obvious if you didn't really know what miniature games were, and especially since Heroscape's kind of a game targeted towards new players. And the reason why this was a bit of a problem is there's that famous saying for sales, or for a lot of things really, you only get one chance to make a first impression. When I would run convention tables where I'd be selling my game at a vendor table or running a demo or something like that, the chance of someone buying a copy of the game if they initially left the basic initial sales contact here without a copy was like 1, 2, maybe 3% of people. So you really want to get that person hooked the first time they come in, or you're probably not going to make a sale. So when Avalon Hill was out there getting all these articles published for Heroscape Age of Annihilation and is pointing them to a campaign page that was not super obvious as to what was going on, they may have been losing a lot of sales that way. Was 8,000 copies or $2 million the real goal of this campaign? Now, about 10 years ago, when I ran several failed crowdfunding campaigns myself, I set out to try to figure out, okay, how do I make these things actually work? And one of the things I kind of discovered was that when it comes to figuring out your backer goal, you want your social media presence to be about 10 times what that actual goal would be. So with Heroscape here, the Heroscapers Facebook had around 3,000 members. Heroscapers.com, if I'm reading the member list right, has about 4,000, but let's be realistic, those are basically the same group of people. Sir Heroscape, who was the largest Heroscape YouTube channel I could find, has around 2,500 subscribers. And then the rest of the TOV live crew combined, they had a little bit over 1,000. If we toss in Avalon Hill's 5,000 Twitter followers, we're now, where are we at there? 11, I don't know, around 11, 12,000. And if you want 10 times as many social media accounts as potential backers, we're still like 65, 70,000, people short of what the goal should be to run an 8,000 backer campaign. What about Hasbro's Twitter account? Why did I not factor that in? Because during the course of the Hasbro Pulse campaign, they didn't seem to say a single thing about it, even though they have like 170,000 followers. But hey, at least new Power Ranger stuff is a lot cooler than things I had when I was a kid. So what about $2 million, and where does that number come from? So I did some back of the napkin calculations, which granted are very broad because we lack a lot of details. And in fact, probably humanity's calculations of the Drake equation are probably more accurate than what I did here for the cost of Heroscape, Age of Annihilation. But when you factor in tooling, payroll for the past year and probably for the next year, and also marketing cost, actual production cost of 8,000-ish units, and it's pretty easy to end up close to $2 million for the actual cost of everything related to Age of Annihilation. Now this takes me back to a comment I made a little bit ago about the size of the starter set. So why such a big starter set? Let's break down the components a little bit here. 74 terrain tiles. Now this is very similar to what we used to see in some of the master sets. And then we had about 64 human-sized miniatures, which is approximately one master set and about 5 to 6 of the old wave-sized boxes. Then we had 5 large miniatures, plus there were 2 others that were listed as a crowdfunding exclusive, so not counting those. So we had this 5 large miniatures, which conveniently were, like a large wave box we had back in the day. And then, of course, if things got to the point, we'd also get those extra hero characters, which could be sold in one box as the, Heroscape Ultimate Hero Collection or something. Plus, we had a jungle terrain set and the castle terrain set as well. So, factoring that all the way I broke it up there, I think the Age of Annihilation Vanguard Edition was probably the planned first year of release for Heroscape Age of Annihilation. And what their Hasbro or Avalon Hill was trying to do was to basically get the hardcore fans to put up the money for the production of the game. Even though there wouldn't be a lot of profit in this initial production run, this would now fund a year of retail production distribution for Avalon Hill, for Heroscape, and the fact that all the hardcore backers got the miniatures and stuff first, this was now going to be basically free marketing for them when the game moved into the more standard retail channels. So that is what I think their ultimate plan was. They're just basically trying to minimize their risk of a massive, large-scale retail launch. So in the end, if you are interested in running your own crowdfunding campaign, there is a lot to learn here and looking at how this campaign turned out. It's a fantastic case study for that kind of a thing. First and foremost, even though crowdfunding itself is a promotional channel, the reality is a lot of the big successful Kickstarters and other crowdfunding things have about 80 to 90% of their backers lined up ready to hand over money at the start of the campaign, whatever it may be. In the case of Age of Annihilation, that total was about 18%. And that's, look at the numbers after about 2 or 3 days. So after those initial batch of about 1,500 or so orders, the orders then came in at an average of 70 per day for the rest of the campaign. And during this initial first couple of weeks, we saw a number of, high-profile-ish publications get articles saying that Avalon Hill was re-released in Heroscape and it was back, go fund it here. And I'm not entirely sure, I don't recall seeing any large bumps corresponding to any of those articles. So if you're hoping for news articles are going to save your campaign, that's probably not going to be the case. And if you're a much smaller game company, it's going to be a lot harder to even get those news websites that publish stuff about your campaign. I've tried. Then we get to the mini wargaming video, which is a promotional video that Avalon Hill paid mini wargaming to make. I have no idea what they made. My guess is several $1,000s. And there's also a TikTok personality who late in the campaign, Avalon Hill sent him some of the miniatures to talk about on I think his 600,000-ish follower TikTok account. On November 1st, which is one day before the release of the mini wargaming video, the campaign was around 3,110 orders. And then by the end, we got to the 4,353, I think it was. And if you do the math, during those final 13 days, the average number of orders was actually around 95 to 100 or so, which means it's quite possible that particular video from Mini Wargaming did actually give a nice little boost to the campaign, or possibly a TikTok person did as well. It's kind of difficult to tell from the numbers I have here, but those last 13 days did outperform the overall average of the campaign. There's one extra thing I would have done if I was in Avalon Hill's position. And I would have taken advantage of the fact that a lot of people have 3D printers in their basement that can produce miniatures that are as good as the prototypes that Avalon Hill was showing off. I would have a set of miniatures ready to go that are just planned to be released free as part of the campaign, or you can actually directly send them to a handful of content creators who paint miniatures. And therefore, you now get those miniatures out in front of people and let them that also go ahead and help sell the campaign a little bit. Of course, the downside there is you're giving away free content, which some companies aren't super thrilled about doing, but that's probably the one thing I would do differently. Would that have made a difference? Maybe, maybe not. It's kind of difficult to say. All right, well, that is about all I have for you guys today. I probably talked for a long time there. I have no idea how long the final video is going to be at this point. I had 4 pages of notes. So I'm Jason, the creator of the Tabletop Battlefield. Thank you guys all for watching. And if you are interested in more kind of crazy fun tabletop game stuff, you can check out the rest of my content at tabletopbattlefield.com. And I am the creator of Legends of Kaladeji, a space combat miniatures game, which is available for sale over at EmpireUnderSiege.com. All right, I'll see you guys next time.